Hello, my name is Andrea, and joining me today is Mr. Sina Vatanpour, who's an associate professor on American Studies at the University of Lille. And first of all, I wanted to thank you for wanting and accepting to take part in this project.
Well, you're quite welcome.
This whole idea comes because in your seminar about the US society that I took in last semester, we didn't have much time, but we did talk about racism in the US as an important factor to understand the current political and societal context. And you explained some issues that I didn't know about or I had never thought about in that way. And when this whole situation in the US exploded, I immediately thought about what we had talked about in class. So the whole point of this exchange is to share that perspective with other people as a way of better understanding what's going on at the moment. And let's get into it. The first thing I was thinking about is we all have some knowledge to a greater or lesser extent about slavery and segregation in the US history. But as non-Americans, I think a lot of us are missing some points that are key to understand the historical heritage of Black identity in the USA today. A lot of people might think that racism ended with the end of slavery, but might not know about the lynchings or the Jim Crow laws. So could you talk us through these post-slavery elements as a way of contextualizing the current situation?
You know, racism has always been there, and it is not something that can possibly finish with the abolition of slavery or even the end of segregation in the United States. Racism is something that is very deeply rooted in our psychology, and in some cases we are almost unaware of its existence within us, in the sense that, you know, some people who even claim to be not racist, in some cases behave in a racist way. And, you know, I really think that racism also has something to do with foreign policy of the United States and also some European countries. It is something that has a lot to do with our society in the way it's organized and also the institutions. You know, when you look at how unconsciously it can function in relation to jobs, for example. People usually choose in their own image. They choose people who are closer to them. And racism has a lot to do with the choice of people during job interviews. When you think of accommodation, when you think of how we have enclaves, meaning how we have certain areas that are inhabited only by minority groups, or when you think of promotions inside companies, etc., some of it is, of course, very openly racist and conscious, and some of it, I think, is unconscious. So, you know, at the same time, that's historical events and historical memory has a lot to do with racism, and, you know, influences the way we look at racism. At the same time, it is not something that puts an end to you know, racist thought or racist behavior in the United States. And, you know, when you however, you know, slavery and segregation have also a lot to do with the way that Americans behave and think at the same time. Yeah. And when you look at racial superiority, white superiority, you know, slavery in a way has a great influence not only on the way that blacks behave and live and think and suffer. It also has a lot to do with the way that whites look at themselves. Slavery made them feel superior, and that superiority continues to be in their minds. And when they look at black people, well, in a way, they look at them as an inferior minority group. So it has influenced both groups to feel superior and inferior, and at the same time, it, in a way, shapes their identities. Shapes their identities in the sense that, for example, a lot of African Americans feel inferior inside them because of the pressure outside. And feeling inferior in a way handicaps them in the sense that they will not use their energy, they will not use their resources to the maximum simply because they think, oh, I cannot do it. Yeah. I'm not good enough because of the things that they have heard or the treatment that they have had. And in the end, this feeling of inferiority damages their career and their lives enormously.
Yeah.
Right? So it has a lot to do with the way that the white people's identity and black people's identity are shaped. Right? Slavery and segregation have a lot to do with that formation of identity. But then, as I was trying to explain, I think racism goes, well beyond the question of slavery. At the same time, that it has a lot to do with it. For example, if we look at the meaning of the word black in the dictionary, or if we take into consideration the meaning of the word white in the dictionary, and also what people understand by the word white, luminosity, clean, angelic, celestial, good, positive, and black connotes what? Black connotes darkness, night, the devil, dirt, yeah. Right? Our psychology in a way has a lot to do with white racism, yeah? And in a way, racism has a lot to do with primitive human fantasies and the way we sort of look at things. Also, if you look at linguistically, if you look at the words that combine with black, for example, if you think of all the negative words that we have, or words that connote illegality. For example, if you think of black market, why do we call it black market? Or if you think of the term whitewashing money, whitewashing money means, making illegal money legal, etc., etc. Black magic. There are a lot of words in this way that actually combine with the word black and communicate a sort of a negative meaning.
Yeah.
And in general, if you like, in the white Christian imaginary, black becomes associated also with the devil. Devil is black, if you like. Therefore, there is this idea of dominating this blackness. There is this idea of controlling this blackness, rejecting this blackness, or eliminating this blackness. When we look at, the policeman sitting on Floyd with his knee on his neck and eventually killing him, which is a terrible, terrible scene. At the same time, we see that position of total domination. We see that position of sitting on the man.
Yeah.
And proudly, there is that feeling of superiority, but at the same time, it communicates eliminating something that he does not want. Yes?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think a lot of people, when they think about racism, all of us know, we say, well, I'm not racist, because we see racism as a conscious act of discriminating someone. But I guess it takes way more subtle ways, right? And I saw this video that went viral. I don't know if you watched it, of this woman, Amy Cooper, who is asked by a black man to put a leash on her dog in Central Park, in a bird watching area where dogs were actually required to be on a leash, right? And she then called the police and told them, quote, she was being threatened by an African American man, end of the quote. And apparently this woman is not the picture of a racist that we have in our minds, saying she votes Democrat, she then said that she didn't consider herself a racist. Yet in this specific moment, she weaponizes the blackness of this man. So Is this uh, is this the shape that racism has taken in the US today? Like, is it the main problem, like a generalized, concealed racism? Is that what you were talking about?
Well, yes and no, in the sense that I was trying to say that racism goes a lot deeper
Deeper.
than just, connection with
With the
slavery. It
slavery.
is, right? That's what I was trying to say. And, the what you're talking about has a lot to do with our society also in Europe,
Yeah.
which is some kind of latent racism, which is even probably worse than direct racism,
Yeah.
because it goes unseen with the choices that people make. And, they can even claim, as you said, to be not racist, however, have a racist behavior or have a, perception of events
Yeah.
such as this one, that is unrealistic and a fantasy in a way.
Yeah. Definitely.
But racism in the United States, of course, is not only latent. We can see with police violence, we can see with the extreme right violence, etc., etc. Racism in America is particularly violent. Yes,
Yeah.
a lot more than other countries. Yes, because racism and slavery, for example, was institutionalized in the United States, and slavery was probably much harder in the United States than in other American countries, South American countries, for example.
Yeah.
In Brazil, for example, usually when a family was sold, all the members of the family were sold together. They avoided selling just the child or just the husband or just the wife. While in America, it was never respected. They could sell, they could break up a family and sell the child to one person and the wife to another and the husband to another, and they would never see each other. And also the violence was very particular also to the United States, more than other countries, yes?
Yeah.
It means a lot of suffering, yes? But after the abolition, of course, racism did not finish at all.
Yeah.
When you think of, for example, the black codes that were set in southern states after the abolition, and the black codes very clearly were there in order to make sure that African Americans remain in a lower social status and continue to work at a lower cost for them. And also when you think of the Jim Crow laws and the segregation that follows, meaning separation of black and white people. Well, these things, these historical events leave a trauma for
Yeah.
the African Americans, which is very, very difficult to get over. When you think that, until 1964, when segregation was abolished or partially abolished, there were different facilities, social facilities for black people, even different cinemas and playgrounds, different swimming pools, different lavatories, drinking fountains for black and white were separate. Schools, that was probably one of the most important ones. And in 1896, this was taken to the Supreme Court, and it became known as the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court confirmed this segregation officially, and it became known as separate but equal. However, there was no real equality. Why? Because the facilities for African Americans were not as good as for white people. And the schools, for example, they did not have the same funds, they did not function in the same way, they did not have the same teachers. So this equality was very much questionable. It wasn't there at all. But it continued until 1964, which is approximately 55 years ago.
Yeah, it's not that long ago. That's why, of course, it still has a lot of implications in today's society. you know, I was trying to make a parallel of this societal division with the context that I'm more familiar with, like Spanish contemporary history. And well, differences of content and form aside, after the dictatorship in Spain that it ended in 1975, there was what we call in Spain a pact of silence, which meant let's not talk about what happened and just try to move on as quick as possible. And it is understandable in the way that after such a collective trauma as a society, you just don't want to spend more time trying to tell the other, well, you did this or you did that, and just move on collectively, right? But I think that this silence has brought and still brings a lot of unrest and a lot of issues in the Spanish context today. Is this the same kind of thing that happened in the US too? Like, was there a collective conversation of society of acknowledging what has happened, which I think is crucial for, you know, healing the wound?
I think, you know, that silence that you're talking about, collective silence, has very little to do with what is happening in the United States in terms of racism and police violence. I think what you're talking about is probably more comparable to the silence of the French about what happened in Algeria and colonization of Algeria, and the tortures and killings of members of resistance and also sometimes innocent people in Algeria. I think it is also comparable perhaps to what the United States did during the Second World War with the Japanese population, American Japanese population living in the United States. You probably don't know, but they built camps, and these camps were protected with walls and barbed wires, and they brought the Japanese living in the United States, forced them to go and live in these camps. And a lot of these people, most of these people, lost their jobs, lost their businesses, etc., etc. And in some cases, entire families were moved into these camps. Or in, you know, in a sort of a more of a extreme case, you can also think of the case of the Native Americans that were almost exterminated and so on. But if you mention the word genocide, for example, nobody will admit it, and there is this silence. Nobody necessarily talks about it. People will say, "Oh, that's terrible," but then that's it. You know, it stops there. There are very few people who will actually, you know, sort of discuss it and, you know, go further with it. I think there is a difference with racism because what is happening in Spain, for example, in relation to this collective silence in relation to the Franco regime is not related to race, but I think it is related to the question of identity or national identity. When you look at the values that Spain or France or the United States put forward as you know, important values in their culture, cultural values, or values attached to the supposed national identity, it has nothing to do with these crimes of the past. It has nothing to do with this particular political behavior or social behavior of the past. And the two become, if you like, contradictory, and it becomes very difficult to adopt both at the same time. Adopt, if you like, values of democracy, equality, etc., etc., and then look at the past and say, well, okay, you know, this was also something that happened, but, you know, how can you reconcile the two opposites? So I think this silence has a lot to do with this idea of not wanting to admit or not being able to admit, because you know, what happened does not correspond to the supposed, and I say supposed, values of today.
Yeah. However, I do believe that admitting and acknowledging what happened is key to reconcile society and kind of close off the divisions. That's mostly what I was referring as, you know, collectively as a society to say, okay, this is what we went through, and we need to come out of it all together.
I suppose that is a possibility and a solution. But for example, if you think of the case of African Americans in the United States, how can that reconciliation be made?
Yeah.
How can they actually be compensated for what they lost, for millions of people who were killed in slavery and suffered in slavery?
Yeah.
And even today, with racism and institutional racism, it is very difficult. Mindset and real change that should take place inside people's conception of things. Yes.
And also contextualizing this in a capitalistic model of economy. Well, talking about police violence, I recently watched a documentary, 13th, on Netflix, which talks about the 13th Amendment in the US, and it throws some light on the issue of mass incarceration in the US, right? And it explains that the country has, through the years, monetized the incarceration system with total profits of millions of dollars. And for this system to keep on running, people need to be continuously arrested. Angela Davis, who is featured in the documentary, says, quote, the prison industrial complex in the US relies historically on the inheritance of slavery. So, of course, we could maybe talk about systemic racism or racism in the institutions, but is it also another example of profit over lives, neoliberal policies, where money actually drives policies?
Well, that's a question that is difficult to answer in the sense that it goes very far, and also it connects with a lot of different fields and ideas. When you really look at it, slavery is some kind of economic organization. In the sense that, definitely. Well, it's basically getting people with, buying people and reducing them to some kind of machine, object, body that works and, brings you profit. So slavery in itself is an economic institution and a profit-making organization. And that is really the meaning of slavery in one way or another. Yeah? When you look at incarceration, there you also see another aspect of racism, in the sense that there are a lot more African Americans incarcerated than white people, proportionally to the percentage of African Americans living in the United States. There are approximately 13% of blacks living in the US. But the number of prisoners, black prisoners, is 4 times higher than white people.
It's incredible.
And which very clearly, once again, shows social problems, economic problems, and judicial problems in relation to the question of race. Today, our society and politics are very clearly driven in association with finance. When you look at, for example, Donald Trump, he is a millionaire.
Yeah.
And you ask yourself, well, how can a millionaire like him, defend the interests of the poor workers or the middle class, white middle class Americans that voted for him? How can he actually defend, their position? And when you look at the way that finance works in relation to politics, even in Europe, basically, finance has the power to bring people to be elected. And this association of finance and politics is very much present, not only in the United States, but also in European countries, almost everywhere, even outside of Europe, etc.
About what you were saying before of racism reproducing in the economic sphere, societal sphere, political, I guess there's also a part of the media, right, perpetuating this idea of especially black men being over criminalized in the media. Is that is that an important part of the discourse, and also related to incarceration, maybe? Like if you all the time in movies or in the TV journals you see, you know, black men being arrested, I guess it also roots the idea even more in the minds of the people.
Certainly, you know, I think that the people who, first of all, you know, in the first level of looking at the problem, I think that the people who work in the media are like any other group. You have people who are racist among them, and you have people who are not racist among them. So there is that, you know, that presence of certain number of people who report in media and who are racist. But apart from that, there is also the question of finance, once again. When you look at the media today, most of the private media, and most of the media today is private, is owned by financiers and people who invest in the media in the same way that they invest in, you know, any other company. And the question is, well, why such interest of people who are rich or financiers in the media? Why? Because it is a way of passing messages. It is a way of protecting themselves. It is a way of getting people elected. It becomes directly associated with politics. Therefore, the media today basically reflect very much the position of the dominant society, political and also finance and economic. They project their interest, and they select events, and they select things, they show things in a very particular way. And you know, I think the media today, seriously, it is very difficult to have real access to real news and real interpretations.
Yeah. Oh,
and I
definitely.
think that that, you know, the media went through a change with the arrival of electronic media. I think that also played a very important role. In the sense that, you know, people don't buy newspapers anymore. A lot of people have access to the news almost for free in one way or another. They do not read the entire article, but at least they have access to the titles. You know, this lack of money and finance in a way brings the media to try and find money elsewhere and accept to be bought
The conditions.
you know, by the people who have the money and who, you know, need to use the media to their ends. So, you know, does the media really reflect things? I would say, well, I don't know, not in all cases and not completely. And at the same time, that applies also to the question of race. And if the media puts forward this dominant ideology, this dominant way of looking at ourselves and our societies, then it is definitely going to put forward a sort of a soft version of things. When you talk about films, it also applies to films. However, in films, it's even worse in the sense that, well, when you look at, for example, the number of actors or actresses who actually you know, get to sort of have a first-rate role in a big commercial film, well, you don't have it. And when you look at black filmmakers, for example, there are very few of them. Right? So there is this, if you like, some kind of choice or censorship that is made almost automatically in the media. And also, you know, it is very difficult until 1970s, beginning of the 70s, end of the 60s, to see any kind of black couple in any Hollywood film. You know, we just simply do not see a love affair, you know, between a black and a white person in American cinema because of the code that was put in place in the 30s, the Hays Code that outlawed miscegenation. And that code begins to break down a little bit at the end of the 60s, but even today, it still continues, even though that, we have that presence, we have those suggestions. Occasionally, we have a black and white couple sort of holding hands, or, however, it is extremely rare to see a film made about a love affair between a black and a white person,
Yeah.
particularly when the male actor, when the man is black.
I remember we talked about this in class when I asked you something like, well, me coming from a city in Spain, I've never been in class with a black kid. We didn't have black teachers, black policemen or women. And so someone who looks at the US and sees, I don't know, Will Smith, Oprah Winfrey, even a black president like Barack Obama, one could say, well, what's the problem, And I remember you talked about these different roles that black men have in Hollywood movies, like the funny guy, the bully,
Yeah, basically you have 5 or 6 stereotypes.
Yeah. Well, talking about the president, how is such a disparity possible? Like, seeing this racism that we're seeing today, for example, in police violence, with having had a black president. Maybe it's a naive question, I don't know, but it shows like two realities. What implication did this Obama election have in terms of racial discrimination?
Once again, it's a relatively difficult question to deal with in a short time, but I personally believe that, for example, Donald Trump's election had a lot to do with Barack Obama's election before him. I think that there was this wish of American people to compensate the election of an Afro-American president. I think it really was a reaction. And when you look at Donald Trump and the way he behaves and, the laws that he puts in place, most of the time, he's engaged in canceling, abolishing systems and laws that were put in place by Barack Obama, and also criticizing those laws and saying, well, it's Barack Obama's fault, etc., etc. There is this very clear-cut criticism of Obama and his administration by Donald Trump. He seems to be in competition with that all the time, yes? And at the same time, he wants to get rid of them. He wants to sort of erase what was put in place by Barack Obama. And then, what is also important here is the United States Constitution, its laws, and its institutions in general, in the sense that, behind this racism, at the same time that we have this terrible racism, there is the rule of law. There is this idea of equality. There is this idea that anyone can start with nothing, and if he works hard and if he deserves it, he can actually reach the top. Yeah. So there is this idea there, and at the same time, well, African Americans represent approximately 13% of the American population. It's a very large population compared to European countries or Spain, for example.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The institutions, the Constitution, the American way of life, at the same time, authorizes, at the same time, accepts in a way. But it was a real change of minds as well. Why? We did not have a black president before Barack Obama.
Yeah.
See what I mean? So there was a very particular historical moment when he was elected. Yes. And here I will advance another idea, which is, very hard to defend. I think that Barack Obama's election also had something to do with the rejection of George Bush before him, and the different wars and, the particular way of dealing with society, in a way, brought American people to try and validate, the American principles of freedom, of equality, etc., etc.
Yeah. I remember again in class talking about this. You said that after, well, the Iraq War and all these scandals that happened, the election of Obama could have been a way of people saying, oh, this is not the United States that we want. Let's prove ourselves that we can do better, right? And look, a black president is a proof of that, yeah.
And when you look at the American society today, you see a very profound division society and among American people. Yeah, and when you see the protests, for example, against police violence and racism, once again you see very clearly that division in American society.
Yeah. Talking about the protest specifically, if you could give us a little bit of more insight on the real situation right now there, because we hear a lot about lootings, we hear a lot about buildings being burnt and chaos, and sometimes I have the feeling that depending on what channel you're watching or what source the info comes, it seems like protesters are being demonized, or in others that they are being defended to the extreme. So without needing to get into your own opinion if you don't want to, but just the actual situation right there, is it as bad as it seems?
Well, I mean, when you have this sort of demonstration and riots in society, when you have this kind of protest, strong protest in society, you always have, a certain number of people who break into stores and steal things, etc., etc. Some of it is simply because, well, they're not necessarily there to protest ideologically, and they take advantage of the situation in order to steal. You always have that. You have that in France, in every country, yes, when there is a demonstration. But at the same time, you ask yourself, well, isn't there a sort of a touch of economic revenge in there? And
that makes sense.
It's a question of taking something that you never received. It's taking something from society that society did not give you, that you think that you deserve to have. I'm not justifying anything, but what I'm trying to say is that yes, there is this aspect of looting, stealing, burning things down, and destroying things. There is that. And at the same time, that I think some of it is just people taking advantage of the situation in order to steal. At the same time, I think there's this dimension of taking revenge for the past or for the present and for the economic conditions that African American community live in. Not all of them. Today in the United States, you have a very good middle class black community. Nevertheless, you still have a very large proportion of the African American population that continue to live with poverty or relative poverty.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview with Trevor Noah, who is a TV host, and talking about these protests and the lootings. He was saying, well, the only reason why people living in society respect laws is because there's this implicit agreement of, I respect certain rules and I get certain rights. But when a part of the population, like African American population, they see that they don't have the same rights as the other parts, what is the validity in that agreement? Like, why should they respect it? So if your people are being killed by the system that is supposed to defend you, what do you have to lose? What do you have to care about burning the Macy's down or Walmart? To me, there's this kind of justice in a way, although, yes, it is breaking things, but for them, it's a broken system already. So why should they care, right?
It's also an expression of their anger.
Yeah. I watched the video you suggested me to watch about the funeral of George Floyd and the Reverend Al Sharpton, the speech he gave. And he kept repeating, this is a time of changing the criminal justice system. And it is true that this particular event has exploded more than any other murders against Black men at the hands of the police, and it has even started movements in other countries. And linking that to another interview that I was listening to, it was a Spanish politician, Iñigo Errejón, and he was explaining that in times of crisis like this one, societal change can be accelerated and things can change a lot in a short time, meaning that political changes that would otherwise take years can take months when a country is going through a deep crisis. And he was referring to coronavirus in Spain. But if we consider the turmoil going on right now in the US as a crisis, do you think this is really a turning point? Or is it just going to die out and nothing will change?
Well, I think, these are times of profound changes anyway. I think we are living in a society in transformation, right? In the past 20, 30 years, we have witnessed very important changes in our society. When you think of the introduction of electronic media, for example, when you think of mobile phones or computers, and networks in general, internet, they have transformed our lives completely. They have changed our way of looking at things completely, and they have accelerated change enormously. In the past 30 years, our society has changed very rapidly, very quickly. So that's a general trend. And at the same time, I think that in a sense, these riots probably have also something to do with confinement period due to the coronavirus, in the sense that people stayed at home, did not go out, did not express their opinions, did not meet other people. So it also becomes a way of expressing their feelings and their ideas suddenly, individually, but also in small and large groups. I believe that it does have something to do with confinement and coronavirus. However, I think that it would have happened in any case. I think people would have protested in any case. But what is remarkable is the size of the protests.
Yeah.
And also how it came to Europe. When you look at France and how people began to protest also in France, you see that it isn't something that is that applies only to the United States. Things started, but it seems to have repercussions everywhere. It seems to be connected to that social and political transformation of our society, and people are asking for something different. And what is interesting is that you have a presence of white people, people of different minority groups, as well as the African Americans. It isn't just African Americans. You have a sort of a mixed population who are asking for social justice, economic justice, and no police violence. I think that is very important. It shows that our society is changing. The mindset of people is changing, and we are probably going to move towards something different. But at the same time, when you look at it, I really think that economic justice also has a lot to do with it. I think it's not just a question of police violence. It's that violence that has become systemic and institutionalized, but also linked with other aspects of social injustice and economic injustice.
No, I completely agree. Well, I think police violence is just one of the many shapes that inequality, racial but also economic, takes in the US, but also in other countries. And seen now, even in my city, which is not a big city in Spain, there was this, well, there were a couple of hundreds of people that gathered to protest because of the murder of George Floyd, but also racism in general, right? I know it's a difficult question, but and you've kind of answered it already, but what end do you see to this situation? Because when I see Trump, how he's dealing with the whole issue, and his what's to me a lack of leadership. People are saying no justice, no peace, but can we really achieve justice with the current political system?
I think that as a consequence of the demonstrations and people asking for less police violence and more justice, social justice, etc., I think some things would change. But I think real change is very slow. I think it will take a lot of time to change completely, if it ever happens, because it may never. Yes, societies sometimes go in the opposite direction as well. I think under the pressure of the demonstrations and people asking for justice, I think that the police system in America will have to adapt itself, and I think that they will adapt themselves perhaps more easily than the police in Europe under pressure, because that is the characteristic, the American characteristic. The change comes a lot easier in a debate, And I think that, Trump, for example, signed a decree saying that, well, the police have to change, and he sort of asked the different police departments to make the necessary changes. So there is this idea of change that is possible. Certain police departments have already started changing. When you see that in certain places the police even resigned in order to sort of in order to protest as well. But that opens up the way to make the necessary changes. At the same time, I don't think that it is possible to change in a few days, because people's minds, people's way of thinking will remain the same. However, we can, for example, say, okay, police racism will be punished very severely. And in that way, if the policeman is racist, he will try to sort of retain himself, control himself, etc., etc. When you look at the situation, for example, in France, and you see that the police unions are protesting very, very strongly in France, and saying that, well, we're not racist, and racism in France is not systemic, etc., etc. You ask yourself, well, is there a difference? Is there a real difference with the United States? Even in the United States, the police protested, a certain number of them. But then you see a lot of them actually kneeling with the demonstrators, saying that they are not racist, and they agree, to have no police violence, etc., etc. It's a very explicit reply, but at the same time, relatively different from France. The unions that are very, very strong are, in fact, saying, okay, this has no sense for us. We need to have, the possibility of doing our jobs, etc., etc. And in a way, some of it is right, but the approach is quite different.
But I always think when there's such a massive part of the population that gathers together to say, hey, this is happening and it is important to us, I think the least thing you can do is acknowledge it, because in the end it's the people you're working for, it's the population. So the public institutions, the state should be recognizable of that. Some of the police departments I know have been defunded. So specific changes happening, and also in the public debate, the fact that we're talking about it, I think it's already a good start.
Yes, it's a very good sign, and I think will bring some changes. However, real change takes a lot of time.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You cannot reform the police and the police department in a month or even in a year.
Step by step, I am positive about change coming. It's good to end up in a good note, though.
A positive note, yes.
Exactly.
happy end.
Well, thank you again for taking part into this, and I personally find it very interesting to get some insight from someone like you who's specialized in this.
Pleasure.